Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk a little bit about this news that just hit regarding the Chabad sect of Hasidic Judaism located in 770 Eastern Parkway, a famous, influential sect in New York City. Been there for many years. The home of the Lubavitcher Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson, their former leader, who many of them regard as the Mashiach, the person in the Jewish religion that they're waiting for. Well, they were discovered with tunnels, secret tunnels underneath their headquarters and their shul, their place of worship, their synagogue, leading out the street. Now, this is illegal, obviously, because who knows what kind of businesses, nefarious businesses, they could have been conducting underneath with those type of temples. I mean, with those type of tunnels. They don't want that in the synagogue. You have your right. Obviously, religious freedom. People have their right to pray. People have their right to worship as they wish, but they don't have the right to have undisclosed locations that they go to. Now, there's a lot of reactions online to this. One such reaction is a very anti-Semitic reaction. Obviously, we know the history in medieval times. There was such a thing called a blood libel, a belief among Christians in in European countries that would take, the Jews would take the blood of Christian kids in order to make matzah for Passover. And this, I think it first started in England, like in the 11th century, which led to the later expulsion of Jews from England at the hands of Edward Longshanks, Edward the First, the king featured in Braveheart. He was the first to expel the Jews, I believe, in the late 1100s. And it was this kid from, I believe, Normandy, one of the provinces of England at the time, who came up missing. And the kid came up missing, and guess who they blamed? The Jewish community. They said that he took the kid and he used his blood to make matzah. Later on, this survived in other parts of Europe that Jewish people went to, and this was notorious. And recently, with the QAnon conspiracy, um, and the outing of several famous pedophiles like Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump and Epstein's list, there is again this black cloud of child abuse going around the Jewish community. The belief that the Jewish community are out to molest, out to harm, out to do bad things to Gentile children, to get revenge on Gentiles. That has always been at the heart of anti Semitism. And because of classic anti Semitism, not the kind of anti Semitism like a person supports Hamas, so automatically they're anti Semitic, or they're against some of the policies of Israel, so they're automatically anti-Semitic. This type of anti-Semitism, this type of vitriol against Jews, this type of conspiratorial thinking against Jews is a very common form of anti-Semitism that has always existed, at least in Europe, with us. It exists now in the Middle East because of European colonialism. Prior to that, yeah, there was hatred against Jews in the Middle East. There was animosity against Jews in the Middle East because of the prominent role that Jews play, especially in the Medinan community, against the early Muslims. But there was never such a thing as blood libels. Blood libels existed in Europe and were pretty much the cause of most pogroms in Europe, including the Kishinev pogrom that we talked about on my channel a couple of years ago in the early 1900s. So what we're seeing on the rise is real anti-Semitism. But I got to say this. When it comes to the Chabad community, and when it comes to the Hasidic community, and when it comes to the Haredi community, ultra-Orthodox community in general here in Brooklyn, they do engage in a lot of illicit activity that is against the law, and they do mistreat, on an, ironically, since they're Hasidic Jews and the word chesed in Hebrew means kindness. They don't engage in kindness when it comes to their Gentile neighbors. Perfect example, 1991's Crown Heights riots, where a child, Gavin Cato, a young Guyanese American boy, was run over by a mitzvah van, and the people in the community, the the Lubavitcher Jews, the Chabadnik Jews, let him die in the streets. That caused the West Indian residents to riot and resulted in the death of um, Australian exchange student and Hasidic Jew himself, Yankel, the stabbing death of Yankel Rosenbaum. So there has been tensions in this community ever since. And even where I am, they're not Chabadniks, but they are Chabadniks. Members of the Chabad sect are a little bit more engaged in the community, so to speak, than members of other sects. Like the sect where I live, the Satmar Hasidim, they are not so much engaged in the community. They have longer payas. They are anti-Israel, not as anti-Israel as Netur Karta, which is Rabbi David Weiss's congregation, but their Rebbe, their leader, their founder, because see, each Hasidic community Okay, the first blood libel that was talking about was William of Norwich. It was in the Middle Ages, and it was in 1290 when Edward Longshanks first expelled the Jews from England. But anyway, uh, see, the Hasidic community, each Hasidic community is designated with a different leader. They call it as a Rebbe, a spiritual master, because the Hasidic community engages in the study of Jewish mysticism, which is called the Kabbalah, secret teachings passed on from one secret master to another secret master. Think of Star Wars, for example, how you have Master Yoda passing his knowledge on to uh, Count Dooku, who passed it on to, say, Qui-Gon Jinn, who passed it on to Obi-Wan, who passed it on to uh, Obi, uh, who passed it on to Anakin and Luke, and so on and so forth. This is how it is with Kabbalah. You have the corpus of Jewish teaching, which is the Tanakh, which we as Christians we call the Old Testament, the Torah, the uh, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Nevi'im are the prophets, prophets, starting say with Elijah, starting with Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea, Habakkuk, Hosea, Habakkuk, Ezra, Nehemiah, all those prophets, the ones that appeared in the land of Israel either after the first exile or during it, to pull the Jewish people back to the worship of one God. That's the prophets. Then the Ketuvim are the writings, Proverbs, Psalms, which are Proverbs are the sayings, Psalms are the songs. Then you have the histories of First Kings, Second Kings, and Chronicles. And then see the Christian Bible, the way that it's set up, ends with and the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, ends with Malachi, and Malachi is one of the prophets, right? But the way the Jews read it is canonized a little bit different. And then you have the Apocrypha, which are certain writings that took place during the Hellenistic period when Israel was under under the Greek rule. We talked about it a lot, the Hanukkah story. Israel was under Greek auspices, under the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic dynasty, and you had the wisdom writings of Ben Sira. You had First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, telling the story of how the Jews gained that victory over the Seleucid kings in Antiochus. Then you have, that's just the Tanakh. By the way, the Apocrypha is not included in the Tanakh, at least not in the Jewish rendering. In the Orthodox, Christian, and Catholic rendering, yeah, those books are in there. That's why they have 73 books as opposed to the general 66 books that the Jewish and Protestant scriptures have. But anyway, and then you have in Jewish learning what they call the oral law. Oral law, according to the Jewish tradition, Moses on Mount Sinai received the written law, which was the Torah, what they call as Torah Shebiktav, and the oral law, Torah Shivopeh, which is the Mishnah. Now, for generations, the Mishnah wasn't written down. It was passed down orally, passed down from first Moses, brought it down on Mount Sinai. He passed it to Joshua, who was his successor, who passed it to the judges of Israel, which became the Sanhedrin. Now, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin was also abolished because the Jews didn't have any sovereignty anymore in their land. So what did they figured out? We're going to lose this, so we have to write this down. A sage named Yehuda Hanasi was one of the first ones to write down the Jewish oral law in the first century. He told one of the Roman emperors, I think it was Vespasian, he told him, listen, give me Yavne. Send me to Yavne, a city on the coast, where there was a bunch of Jewish scholars. And he basically started to write down the Mishnah. Now, the second part of the Talmud is the Jewish, the commentaries on the Mishnah. They're written in the language of Aramaic, and that is the Gemara. So the Talmud consists of the Mishnah and the Gemara. They're basically two versions of the Talmud, one an earlier version, which they call the Palestinian Talmud or the Yerushalmi Talmud, and that's a shorter version, as well as an older version written by the rabbis in Jerusalem. And then you have the larger version written by the rabbis in Iraq, in Babylon. A section of the Torah, a section of the Hebrew Bible, and then they'll have a Daf Yomi, which is a section of Talmud, each and every day. And each and every day, a serious student of Judaism study this, right? He'll have a Heruta, a Jewish study partner, and he'll study, 2 by 2. But when it comes to the Kabbalah, there are certain rules amongst the rabbis and the sages that you can't study it unless you're the age of 40. Now, the Kabbalah, it's unclear when it was actually written. Some say it was written in the Galilee, in the first century by a man named Yohanan ben Zakkai. Others say that it was written around the Spanish period of the 14th and 15th century, uh, and rediscovered by uh, a man named Moses de Leon, and written down in this book called the Zohar. But it's not necessarily, Kabbalah is not necessarily a book, it's a group of teachings, but the Zohar is one of those books that are heavily important to the Jewish mystical tradition. And again, you have to be age 40. You have to be learned in Jewish law, halakha. You have to have studied the Mishnah Torah, which is Maimonides' writings, the Shulchan Aruch, which was written a few years after Maimonides by a man named Joseph Caro. It's a book of halakha, a book of Jewish law. Another one, all these other texts, and be firmly implanted in the idea of Jewish law and Jewish practice, and the 13 principles of Judaism, which were spelled out by Maimonides' credo confessions in Judaism, to really study these books. But the Hasidic movement does study that. They're particularly influenced by a man named Isaac Luria. He was in exile from Spain after the Catholics took over Spain in 1492. We talked about it. Sephardic Jewish people went back to the land of Israel. They started to live in Sefed, and many of them were Kabbalistic masters, and Isaac Luria was one of them. So they are also students of the Arizal, another Spanish exile. So they are heavily into the Kabbalah, and the Hasidic movement came about in the 18th century in the Ukraine with a man by the name of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, what does this mean in Hebrew, the Baal Shem Tov? Well, the master of the good name. He was a guy that he made amulets, and then all of a sudden, he had this vision, and he decided to, rather in his little town in Eastern Europe, peasants couldn't afford to sit in the Talmud. Sit in the yeshiva all day and study the Talmud and study the sages. They couldn't afford that, so they were really lacking in the necessary knowledge and equipped in Judaism. So he decided to bring the study of Judaism to the masses with song and with joy, and he believed in the Kabbalistic idea of igniting the divine spark, the divine what they call the divine neshama of Judaism, and that's how the Hasidic movement was born. Now, not everybody agreed with him. Famously, the Vilna Gaon issued a responsa, a letter against him. And since that time, what they call the Miznagdim and the Hasidim have been enemies. The Miznagdim in Hebrew means the opponents. Sometimes they're referred to in Yiddish as Litvak, because the Vilna Gaon was in Vilna, a city in Lithuania, a Baltic country. So they would call the Lithuanian Jews as opposed to the Hasidic Jews, because everywhere in the Jewish world at that time, Hasidim came about. You had ones in Poland, ones in Ukraine, ones in Russia, everywhere except for Lithuania. So the Litvaks, they became the Misnagdim, the enemies of the Hasidic movement, even though they themselves were ultra-Orthodox. Because at this time, too, the 1700s and 1800s, around the time of the Alter Rebbe. Now, Alter Rebbe, he founds Chabad Lubavitch in the town of Lubavitch, in the Ukraine, in 1770, in the 1770s, and he writes another spiritual book that is the basis of Chabadnik teachings, the Tanya. So, uh, and his grandson is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now, there is some controversy with regards to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as far as uh, like I said in the beginning of the video, certain Jewish people believing that he is the Mashiach. Obviously, we know famously Jewish people don't accept traditionally the person that Jews and Christians and Muslims believe is the Messiah, which is Jesus Christ. They famously reject that, so they're always looking for somebody else as the Jewish Messiah. In the first century, they were embarrassed by a man, even Rabbi Akiva, one of the most famous rabbis and one of these starters or one of the beginners of what is today rabbinical Judaism. He famously declared that Bar Kokhba was the Jewish Messiah, and Bar Kokhba staged a revolt against the Romans in the early 100s and lost, and that resulted in the exile of the Jewish people for the next 2,000 years. Another famous example would be Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi, a man living in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, went around declaring to his followers that he was the Messiah. And most of the Jewish community came out of the Sephardic community. He was Turkish. Most of the community, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, were going around saying that he was the Messiah. What does he do? He gets captured by the Sultan in Istanbul and he converts to Islam. You know what I mean? So obviously he's not the Messiah. So many fake pretenders have come and they'll say, oh, they're the Mashiach, because Jewish people are still waiting for their Messiah. They didn't believe it was Jesus because to them, Jesus did not fulfill the criterion. He didn't liberate the Jewish people from the oppression of the Romans. And now Christian theologians and the early Christian writers such as Paul, they reinterpreted this and they said, well, it was spiritual slavery, it was spiritual bondage, and Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus' death on the cross liberated us from the bondage of sin, right? So they were expecting redemption from physical bondage, much like Moses had done to them in the book of Exodus, freedom from Egyptian slavery, or Cyprus the Greater, freedom from Babylonian captivity. They were expecting that again, and Jesus just didn't do that. So that's why the Jewish sages rejected him as the Messiah. And on top of that, this is the Pharisees. The other group, the Sadducees, that were the temple priests, like the high priest Caiaphas at that time in the New Testament, they rejected him because they were in cahoots with the Romans, and they were getting kickbacks from the Roman governors, particularly and emperors like Vespasian and Titus and Hadrian, and they were in the pockets with the Romans, so they rejected him. So if he's going to try to overthrow Roman rule in Judea / Palestine at that time, they didn't want anything to do with him, so they turned their backs on him. So both groups that were prominent at the time, in Jesus' time, in Roman Judea / Palestine, rejected him. And from that point on, subsequently, in the battle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees won out, and modern day Judaism is the Pharisees won out, and modern day Judaism is much more shaped by the Pharisees than the Sadducees. Rabbinical Judaism has its origins in the teachings of the early rabbis like Yohanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Akiva, Hillel, Shammai, and what they call the Hazal, the sages of the Sanhedrin, whose rulings compiled like the Talmud. But as far as this situation, uh, Chabad always feels like they're above the law, and I just feel like if this was another community, if it was Muslims, right, and a mosque was raided, they would have reacted violently towards it. We saw even the Israelis every time they raid the Al Aqsa compound in Jerusalem, everybody gets laid out, everybody gets sprayed out. Here, these people are acting belligerent with cops, and cops aren't doing anything. And the Haredi community uh, in the United States and in Israel as well both feel like they're above the law. That's one of the biggest problems with politics within Israel, is that the Haredi community oftentimes clashes with the majority, either secular community, Mesoti, which is traditional, or even modern Orthodox Dati Lumi groups in Israel. So because they rarely pay taxes, they collect tons of welfare, they have tons of kids, they have more kids in their neighborhoods, both in New York, Crown Heights, Williamsburg, and Borough Park, and their neighborhoods in Jerusalem, like Mer Sharim, or their neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, like Bnei Brak. So they clash with the people because nobody likes to feel that uh, you feel like you're better than another person, and that's how they feel. I mean, think about it. Even in Israel, like I said, many Haredi Jews are anti-Zionist, especially the Satmar community. Chabad, not so much. The Satmar community more so because of the teachings of their Rebbe, Yoel Teidenbaum, who felt that Zionism was an abomination to Judaism because by their belief, they're in the galut, they're in the exile because God punished them from the land. God took the land away from them. God had given the land to them because of their own righteousness, because of their brit, because of their willingness to keep God's covenants, his commandments, 613 laws of the Torah. And when they didn't do that, God sent them into exile, Babylon. And when they didn't do that again, God sent them into exile after 70 AD. First with the destruction of the temple in 134 AD after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it was God that was going to bring them out. But as many people know, and we talked about it before in this channel, the Zionist movement is a secularist movement. It's not a movement born out of religion. Hell, Theodore Herzl, who was the founder of the Zionist movement and the head of the Zionist Congress until his death, um, wanted to convert the Jewish community in Germany and Austria to Christianity. He wrote to the Pope about the possibilities of converting the Jewish community in that area to Catholicism. So he was not Orthodox. Ben Gurion was not Orthodox. Golda Meir, those that came in the second, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, Hovevei Zion, Jewish socialists that built many of the kibbutz in Israel. Not religious people, secularists, influenced by Russian socialism and communism. As a matter of fact, after 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian communists considered maybe that Israel would be a friend to them. But it wasn't until um, Israel chose to side with the United States and the agreements that through his best friend and army buddy Truman had struck up with Jewish leaders in the Democratic Party, and Israel and the United States became best friends because Jewish Americans were highly influential in the Democratic Party, and Truman felt that it would be expedient 11 minutes after the founding of the state of Israel to recognize Israel. And from that point on, Israel was a staunch ally of the United States, and then the Soviet Union, who kind of felt betrayed, became staunch allies of the Arab nations that were fighting Israel, such as Gamal Abdel Nasser's regime in Egypt. So, point being, Israel's a secular nation. These religious people, the Haredi community, they were there already. They were there before 1882. 1882, January of 1882, is the official day, the official beginning of what they call the first Aliyah, the movement of Jewish people from Eastern Europe to Israel. They got off the boat in Gatz, from Gatz, Romania, into Jaffa. At that time, there was no Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv wasn't founded until 1909. They got off the boat and they were greeted by fellow co-religionists who were Sephardi. And initially, there was tensions between the old Yeshuv and the Sephardi community and the new Ashkenazis that were coming in. Again, because of religiosity, they came in completely secular. That was one of the reasons why they had clashes with local Arabs, whether the Arabs were Sunni, Muslim, or Druze. I mean, Sunni Christian. I mean, Sunni Muslim, Druze, or Christian. You know what I mean? Because the Arabs were completely religious, and the Jews were not. The Jews were a-religious. So ultra-Orthodox religious Jews, they feel like having Israel as a state that's not religious, as that not only not religious, but mocks religion, mocks the Jewish religion, has the Jewish Star of David, has the colors of the Jewish tallit, the Jewish shawl of blue and white, has a menorah is its national symbol, but at the same time, stuff is not really closed on Shabbat. Um, Leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu, Yair Lapid, and Naftali Bennett, he wore a yarmulke, but uh, they abuse the religious parties. They don't want the religious parties to really gain prominence, or at least they didn't. Not the early Zionists anyway. The early Zionists, like I said, they were all labormen. It wasn't until Menachem Begin in the 70s when that kind of changed, and Menachem Begin reached out to the more traditional Sephardic communities. You know what I mean, for votes, and the modern Orthodox communities. And now you do see religious prime ministers, like I said, like Naftali Bennett, that are religious. But Benjamin Netanyahu is not religious, but they'll use religious language. The Zionists will use religious language in order to justify certain actions. Like you'll have Ben Gurion coming on TV calling the Palestinians the Amalekites. Now people wanted to know what's this reference to the Amalekites? Well, in the Bible, when the Jews were coming out of Egypt for the Exodus, this group, the Amalekites, another Semitic group, descendants of Edom or Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, the one that the Bible says God hated, right? They sneak attacked, they Pearl Harbored, if you will, the Jewish people as they were going into the land. And forever they've been the enemies of the Jewish people. And Saul refused to destroy them, and that's why Saul was thrown out as the king. So according to the rabbis, each and every generation, a son of Amalek pops up. Like Haman, the aide of Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, is considered a descendant of Amalek. Hitler was maybe considered a descendant of Amalek. Queen Isabella and Ferdinand, the initiators of the Spanish Inquisition, they were considered maybe a son of Amalek. And nowadays, in modern discourse, many are saying that the Palestinians are descendants of Amalek. So this kind of language, and what does the Bible commend that the Jewish people do to the descendants of Amalek? Wipe them out. So basically, cryptically, Benjamin Netanyahu was calling for genocide of Palestinians. So my point being that they're not religious, and this not religiousness, this irreligiousness, this fact that they're chiloni. This is the Hebrew word. This is the Hebrew Israeli Hebrew word used for secular Jews, chiloni, and the other ones are Haredim, uh, the ultra orthodox. There's clashes between them, and groups like Chabad, of course, they're going to have problems because they don't serve in the army, and serving in the army for every Jewish Israeli, doesn't matter what background you come from, and Jews too, Jewish Israelis and Druze people, Druze and Jews serve in the IDF. Muslims and Christians do not. Sometimes Bedouins do. Bedouins, of course, they're Arabs and Muslims, but they have a different sort of lifestyle than regular Arabs. You know what I mean? So, and they live in the Negev desert. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't either. You know what I mean? So, but this service bonds people together. So whether you have an Ashkenazi kid that's a Sabra born in Israel, a Russian kid, a Sephardic kid, an Ethiopian kid, Bukharian from Uzbekistan kid, Ben Menashe, Ben Ephraim, any kind of any kind of Jewish kid, he's gonna serve in the IDF. He's gonna learn Hebrew. He's gonna be acculturated to the ways of Israeli culture. Whereas the Arabs the Arabs and the Haredi kids aren't. And the Haredi kids and the Arabs are the ones having the most babies. You know what I mean? Because they're ultra religious, both sides. So uh, tensions. So sometimes you'll see clashes between the Haredi people, and religious Jews, especially like there are certain rules regarding Temple Mount. We talked about it before, where Jews can't go up there. Sometimes Jews want to break the rules and go up there. Same thing in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah. They want to break the rules and go up there. And in New York City, during the time of Mayor de Blasio, it was the same thing. Uh, we couldn't pray during COVID. No congregations could get together. It didn't matter if you was Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Sikh. Sikhs couldn't have their langar. Uh, Christian people couldn't have prayer service. Muslims couldn't have Juma. Nothing. That was COVID. No more than 10 people could be in there. But when it came to the Hasidic community, right, they continuously violated this tenet, and that led to clashes with them and former Mayor de Blasio. So many people are saying this is what the official rabbis of the Chabad Lubavitch community are saying about this incident. They're saying that they built the tunnels to have secret services during Shabbos on during COVID. You know what I mean? But we've been going with COVID for about 2 or 3 or 4 years now. Why haven't they demolished them? So obviously there's something nefarious going on. I believe it's drug use. I know that the Jewish community in New York watch that movie High Rollers. A lot of them travel to Israel, and Israel is the biggest producer of ecstasy tablets, ecstasy pills in the United States. So, I mean, Israel's known for more than just rave music, uh, grape tomatoes, terrorism, and Manischewitz and great Manischewitz wine, brother. You know, you know what I mean? And Natalie Portman. It also produces ecstasy at an alarming rate. You know what I mean? So these guys, they got their Steinwolls, they got their hats, their tzitzit, their traditional religious clothing, and they're probably stuffing, tablets of ecstasy in their freaking clothes. You know what I mean? So something something nefarious is going on. You know, and the NYPD has the right to do it. But my thing is, look how they reacted. They were being belligerent. They tore up their own seats, their own benches in their own synagogues. You know what I mean? But had it been a black community, had it been a Hispanic community, once again, like January the 6th, um, it's a double standard. You know, oh, these guys riot. Oh, that's nothing. These guys riot. They all deserve to be dead. We end up with another Ferguson and another Baltimore because the cops couldn't control how they reacted to certain people. It's just unfair. But anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. I don't think this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I don't think that NYPD is targeting um, Jews because, if anything, the NYPD is highly conservative, and most conservatives are pro-Israel. You know what I mean? I buy the idea on college campuses that there may be some anti-Semitism, but even that I don't buy because from what I've seen, at least here in the United States, Palestinian celebrities that are speaking up about it, not the ones that ain't like DJ Khaled, but the ones that are speaking up about it, right? Like famous uh, cerebral palsy advocate and Arab American advocate. She advocates for both Arab American rights and the rights of people with cerebral palsy, and she's a comedian, funny lady, Maysoon Zayed. She posted about it on her page on Palestine, the things that the Palestinian and the Arab community and the Muslim community should be boycotting, right? And things like Starbucks, things like McDonald's, and they want to do it in a really non-violent way because one of the things that detractors always say about the Palestinian struggle is like, oh, I don't respect the Palestinian struggle because they don't have a Gandhi, a Gandhi resisting British rule in India. They don't have somebody that's preaching nonviolence, or Martin Luther King or Cesar Chavez with the Farmers March in the 60s. They don't have somebody preaching nonviolence. Everybody is Yasser Arafat or Hamas or Hezbollah or the PFLP, or the Black Tigers and Black September in 1972. Everybody is that. There's no nonviolence, but that's bullshit. We're doing it the right way now. We're doing it through boycotts. We're getting the attention out there for the genocide in Gaza. That's everybody on the left. But everybody on the right, all the politicians on the right, except for Vivek Ramaswamy, is speaking out for Israel, cocking for Israel. I mean, Nikki Haley is doing that. Mike Pence was doing that. Chris Christie was doing it. Vivek is the only politician on the Republican side to say, look, we need to cut aid to Israel. And as soon as he said we need to cut aid to Israel, man, the Israel lobby, both Gentiles and Jews, came out and been like, man. So I haven't really seen the rise in anti-Semitism in this. So I don't get what they're saying. You know what I mean? I know in 2019 there was that guy that was hacked up, that rabbi during Hanukkah, by an extremist sect of the Black Hebrew Israelites, which Black Hebrew Israelites who call Orthodox Jews Edomites. I don't think they care about Edomites anyway. You know what I'm saying? They're just doing their own thing, trying to save their own people. You know what I mean? A lot of this stuff is false. You know what I mean? You had the Tree of Life Synagogue shot up in 2018. You had the Poway Chabad Center shot up in San Diego in 2019. But sometimes when you see a swastika painted on the side of a synagogue, sometimes they painted it themselves just to incite violence against people. Because the whole idea of it is the more anti-Semitism, the better. The more they can make themselves look like a victim of anti-Semitism, the better, and complain about it and use it to gain an advantage. Use it to appear like a sheep when they really are lying, or use it to stifle legitimate criticism of Israel in the settler movement. Okay, you can't say anything about Israel, even though these rabbis aren't even, like I said, necessarily Hasidic rabbis, Haredi rabbis, Haredi groups and rabbis, and Hasidic groups and rabbis. They're not necessarily Zionists. They don't even care about the state of Israel, but just by being Jewish, just by being connected in a certain way, just because the look at Yaakov Shapiro, another guy, not Ben Shapiro, Yaakov Shapiro, a speaker from Satmar, right? They don't they don't necessarily care about Israel either, but they speak about it because everybody feels like, oh, all Jewish people are connected to it, and many Haredi people, many Hasidic people go to Israel to study. They don't participate in the politics or anything, but they go there to study. They go there to um, be next to the Western Wall, be next to the Cave of Machpelah, other religious sites, that are associated with Judaism. But it's just funny uh, how that works. It's just like with Islam. I mean, here you have Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein, who is a Ba'athist, right? A secular Arab nationalist, doesn't have anything to do with Islamism, hates Islamists, hates groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, hates groups like Al Qaeda, like ISIS, like the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially because they're Shia, right? He, uh, and Persian, hates groups like that. But people like George W. Bush, oh, Saddam Hussein must have chemical, he must be harboring Al Qaeda terrorists. Why would he harbor Al Qaeda terrorists? If anything, the Al Qaeda terrorists hate him more than the United States hates him because he's secular, right? And they don't want to implement a secular ideology. It's sort of like if an enemy of the United States throws left-wing liberalism in with evangelical Christianism and say, well, they both want freedom, right? But freedom, as they see it, is defined in a different way. Freedom, as the Ba'athists see it, is defined differently. It's a secular vision. It's an emphasis on Arab history. In fact, the Ba'athist Party was founded by a man named Michael Aflaq, a Lebanese Christian, not a Muslim. Had nothing to do with Islam. Islamism goes back to a man, a philosopher in the Middle Ages by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah, and was advanced by another individual in the mid 20th century, an Egyptian clerk named Said Qutb, who wrote the book Milestones. Basically, it was an answer, just like Hasidim was an answer, or Zionism was an answer. Zionism and Hasidim were answers, one religious, one secular, to the encroachment of Western modern liberalism on Jewish values. The answer that the Hasidics had was, we will go deeper into our tradition, we'll become overly zealous for our tradition, we'll become fanatical. Similarly, in the Muslim world, and this was even worse because the Muslim world was dominated by the West, colonized by the West. France colonized North Africa, Britain colonized most of all of India, which contained a large amount of Muslim communities in the modern day countries of Bangladesh and Pakistan. And then later they colonized Egypt, and after the Ottoman Empire, they colonized the Middle East. So they're confronted with modern secularism, just like the Jews. The Jews were confronted by it because of the emancipation and the Haskalah movement. The Muslims were confronted by it with colonization. So one side says, okay, we're going to go completely secular. We're going to adapt to the modern world, similarly like Turkey did in 1922 when they abolished the caliphate and they went completely secular. Iran did this too before 1979. They went completely secular. They got rid of um, all all religious representation in the government, and they went completely secular. Marxism was on the rise, secularism was on the rise, atheism was on the rise in the world. So these religious movements were put to the background. They thought it was all about secular socialism, just like the early Zionists. The Arab nationalists thought the same thing. They were heavily attracted to the idea of socialism and secularism. But that didn't work out. You know what I mean? The Arab Republic that Nasser and Hafiz Hafiz Assad, the father of the current Syrian president Bashar al-Assad, put together, it dissolved. The Arab countries couldn't work together. Um, uh, Nasser tried to take over in Yemen with his side. You know, Yemen was in a civil war at that time, kind of like it is now. But back then it was communism versus capitalism as opposed to Shia versus Sunni. He had his own Vietnam and Yemen, and that didn't work out. So the last of the Mohegans, if you will, of the Ba'athist Party was Saddam Hussein, who, yes, he did help out Palestinian suicide bombers the during the Gulf War, and I think a few times during uh, the well, not really the Second Intifada, because his country was taken over in 2003 by the United States, but um, during the Gulf War. But again, the Palestinian Authority, the PA, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, right, Hannah Ashawari, and Ahmad Zakini, they were secularists. They weren't religious like Hamas. Now we have religious taking over. Religion and politics has risen around the world in the last 50 years. With the failure of Marxism and Leninism and secularism, religion and politics has risen. We saw the Soviet Union collapse. We saw China liberalize its economy in the 70s. We saw Cuba on its last legs, and North Korea become really isolationist to the point that people go to North Korea today, and it's like another planet. So socialism is not popular. So what's the alternative to that? Is religion. The religious propaganda of the United States helped defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, plus arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, arming militants to go against um, the Soviets in the Central Asian republics that are Muslim, or in the places like Bosnia that are Muslim with regards to Yugoslavia, help aiding the refuseniks in Israel with the Soviet Jew movement in the 60s and the 70s and 80s to get out of the Soviet Union and go to Israel, right? Many of them not religious, but still, the Cold War was framed in religious terminology. Now, the collapse of the Soviet Union, even Russia is going back to Russian Orthodox religion, and Putin is putting a lot of Russian Orthodox um, symbolism into his uh, into his way he conducts himself. Alexander Dugin, who's his right hand man, his advisor, he's freaking like he's like a Russian Orthodox priest. You know, the rise of evangelicalism here in the United States, first with the election of Jimmy Carter, the first born again Christian president, and then Reagan courting the evangelicals, then Bush courting the evangelicals, then um, in India, what are we seeing in India? The rise of Indian nationalism, the rise of the Hindutva party, the rise of the BJP, you know, discrimination against Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs in India. You know what I mean? So everywhere around the world, we're seeing religion be remarried to politics in a way we haven't seen since the 18th, 19th century. And this is a manifestation of that. There's always going to be clashes and growing pains, I feel like. So I think a lot of these religious people like Chabad, they feel like they can do whatever they want and the police can't touch them. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're like MC Hammer and shit. You can't touch me. You know? Peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out. Love you guys.